better, Lee. Really." She looked up at him. They'd only been here for 3 days, and most of it had been a little like watching a horse reined in too tight. Sure, he could suffer the easier slopes, and she had no doubts Brandon was having fun because they were together. But she also knew he was probably itching to get going on something like this. "No, baby," she told him, girding her imaginary loins. She faced the slope. "Let's do this last run. Then we can hit the hot tub." "Sounds good." No kiss. It would have been too awkward on skis, but he grinned and turned his body to the edge of the slope. "Let's go." He went. Lee went a moment after him, her heart in her throat as the wind burned her cheeks. It wasn't so bad. She'd taken lessons. She could do this. The bright white snow shone in the brighter, whiter light from the high lamps. The slope needed a good grooming. She squinted, aware that someone had come up behind her, was passing her, and that Brandon had slowed himself so she could catch up. That wasn't what she wanted, though. She wanted a wide berth, room to zigzag. If it wouldn't have totally embarrassed her, she'd have made pizza with the tips of her skis to slow herself down. As it was, she just breathed deep and focused. And she was doing great, until some lack of shadow confused her and she hit a bumpy patch of ice that sent her flying just a little too high and a little too fast. Pain. She didn't hear a splintery sound or anything that would indicate a break, but nevertheless, Lee's ankle and shin burst into an explosion of agony. She spluttered, snow up her nose and down the front of her coat, not quite sure what had happened or what was going on, only that somehow she'd ended up on her face in the snow, her leg twisted beneath her, her skis popped off and halfway down the mountain. She was lucky she hadn't stabbed herself with a ski pole. "Lee, are you okay?" Brandon must have caught a glimpse of her tumble and stopped a couple 100 feet below her. He pulled off his goggles and stuck his poles into the snow to keep them from falling over, then stepped out of his skis to climb the steep, slippery slope toward her. Lee winced, as much at the indignity of her position as the pain, which had now dulled to a throb. "I hate night skiing." "Can you stand?" "I think so." But she couldn't, something they both discovered when he bent to give her a hand up, and the smallest bit of weight on her injured ankle made her hiss with pain and sag in his grip. "Damn it!" "Take it easy. I can get the ski patrol." He paused, shaking his head. "I don't want to leave you. Do you think you can tandem with me? The end's just around the bend. There's a big dip there, but nothing as bad as up at the top. If I can get you there, you could slide down on your butt." "Of course I could," Lee said with another wince. She didn't want to sit here and wait until someone came for her, but she had no idea what he meant by tandem. She figured it out a couple minutes later, as Brandon helped her up and back into her skis, then positioned himself behind her and had her hold onto the poles he held out in front of her like a grip bar. "This is how they teach little kids sometimes," he told her. "It's not pretty, but it'll get you down the mountain." It was far from pretty. It was, in fact, downright humiliating, and it still hurt, even though Brandon had instructed her to hold her injured ankle as still as she could to let him do the heavy work in the turns. At least it was fast, though by the time they got to the bottom, Lee'd broken into a cold sweat from the pain. 2 exams from the EMT and a tightly bound ankle wrap later, the sprain had been diagnosed, advice on care given, and Lee had hobbled back to the condo with Brandon's help. Now, settled in front of the fireplace with her foot up and a mug of hot cocoa brimming with melted marshmallows, she felt a little better. "What a stupid idea," she told Brandon finally. "Now I've ruined the trip. I'm sorry." He settled next to her in the chair and a half. "Don't be sorry. I should have waited for you. I knew you had trouble with night skiing and black diamonds. I should have been paying better attention." Lee put her head on his shoulder. I didn't want to hold you back. He looked at her. You don't. Lee smiled and traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip. In skiing? I definitely do. Well, it's not like I care. I know you don't, she said with a sigh. But sometimes I do. I mean, we're only on this trip because you wanted to make me happy. We could be with your parents right now. Sleeping on a lumpy mattress and having to make sure we don't make too much noise when we're having sex? Brandon shook his head. Not the way I want to spend our first Christmas together married. But you always spent Christmas with your parents, Lee told him. Every year. Until I came along anyway. I don't want to be the one who makes things change for your family like that. Will you stop? He laughed. Things changed for me when I was the first son to move away. Sure, I went back for Christmas because I had no reason not to. But now, we're a family. And sure, I don't mind spending holidays with my family. I love my family. But I love you too. And they love you. It's all good. We didn't get a honeymoon, remember? I told my mom we were planning this trip instead. She understood. She probably didn't like it. Brandon laughed. Maybe not, but she didn't say so. Besides, she told me herself that she was looking forward to going to my brother's house for Christmas dinner, so she didn't have to cook for once. And you believe her? He laughed again and cuddled her closer. Maybe not, but that's what she said. Point is, she didn't make a big deal out of it, and they're flying out to visit us in a few weeks, so we'll do Christmas with them then. Lee was silent, hoping he was right. Doesn't change the fact that because of this, she gestured at her ankle, I've ruined the trip. Shut up, Brandon told her. I'm here with you. That's all that matters. She had to laugh. Did you just tell me to shut up? Yep. Really? She gave him an assessing look, then gripped his chin in her hand, holding his face steady. That's the mouth you kiss your wife with? Any chance I get. How about now? She asked, but pulled her mouth away from his at the last second with a low laugh. Ah, ha, ha. Why should I kiss you when you talk to me like that? Because you want me to kiss you, Brandon told her. All over. Well, Lee admitted. I guess that's true. It certainly was. Eggs and toast. Nothing fancy, but he was good at it. And besides, Lee liked it. Brandishing a plate in one hand and a spatula in the other, Brandon appeared in the bedroom doorway with a flourish. Breakfast is served. Lee, propped up on a pile of pillows against the headboard, set aside the magazine she'd been flipping through. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing at the pressure, and Brandon moved forward quickly to put the plate on the nightstand. Nope, he told her. Back in bed. If I didn't know any better, I'd say this was a plot of some kind. Maybe, he teased. But you'll have to eat your breakfast first. His wife laughed, but moved back against the headboard. Smells great. Brandon settled on the bed next to her and took up the plate and fork, laden with fluffy scrambled eggs. Here. Oh, you're going to feed me? That's service. She sounded like she was teasing, but her voice had dipped low in a way that never failed to send a little shiver up and down his spine. I aim to please. He fed her the bite of eggs, watching her eyes close and her mouth open, watching as her face twisted in pleasure. So good. I was starving. Thank you, baby. Lee chewed and swallowed and opened her eyes, catching him looking. Her gaze flared. He loved that she knew him so well. They're perfect. She opened her mouth for him to feed her another bite. This time, though, the eggs slipped off the fork and Lee had to catch them. She laughed, wiping her mouth as she poked him. Careful. He took a bite of them himself, and between the two of them they'd finish the eggs in no time. Lee reached across him for a piece of toast, breaking it into small pieces and alternating bites for herself and feeding him. It was the sort of thing newlyweds did, Brandon thought, as he took the bite of toast from her fingers. Sort of silly, but fun, too. And he liked making her laugh. Now the bed's full of crumbs. She sighed and licked butter from her fingers. And I need a shower. I'll help you. He got off the bed and slid an arm beneath her butt, the other behind her shoulders. Heave-ho! Lee giggled as he swept her up, but didn't protest. Instead, she cuddled, soft and warm, against his bare chest. She nuzzled him just above the nipple, which didn't make it much easier to carry her, considering how it distracted him. I love it when you get all caveman on me. What? I should just let you hobble to the shower on that ankle? Brandon said as he carried her into the bathroom. What kind of husband would I be then? A bad one, Lee said solemnly. And I'm not a bad husband. Nope, definitely not. Best husband I ever had. Her arms curled around his neck as he lowered her gently onto one foot, the other lifted just enough to prevent her from putting weight on it. Ha, nice one. He squeezed her ass. Only husband you ever had. Unless you're not telling me something. Nope. She looked over her shoulder at the shower. This should be fun. Rest that ankle. I'll help you. He warned and turned the water on, setting the temperature just how she liked it, and then helping her so carefully out of her clothes she laughed and poked his bare chest. I'm not an invalid, Brandon. He shrugged. I do it for you when we're at home because you like for me to do it. Why wouldn't I do it when you really need my help? Lee sobered, brows knitting. She slid her hand over his heart, then up his throat to cup his cheek. Brandon turned his face to kiss her palm. I know you like to, she said in a low voice. It just feels different when you have to. That's all. They'd had a hard few months after she lost her job and needed to rely on him as the breadwinner. For Brandon, it had been no big deal to pool their funds. They were getting married, after all. And that's what a man did, right? Take care of his wife, however she needed it. And even though he hadn't made as much money in his job as she had in the one she'd lost, it had been enough for what they needed. It had scraped at her, though. A lot. His wife was one independent woman, and he wouldn't have her any other way. Even if it was a little frustrating sometimes. It still gets me hard, he said, offhandedly enough to pretend he was teasing her, which he wasn't. His dick was definitely already getting hard. She looked between them. I see that. Tell you what, if you promise not to fall on your butt in there, I'll leave you alone. As much as it pains me, he added, just to make sure she knew he was being serious. I think I can manage a shower on my own. I can call for you if I really need help. You sure? I could wash your back. She smiled. The offer's tempting, but no. He didn't really want to leave her alone in the bathroom, and not just because he was horny, but he knew better than to push her. If she said she wanted to be alone in the bathroom, she meant it. He kissed her, though, long and slow and thoroughly, just so she'd be sure to notice exactly what she'd be missing. Go, Lee said softly, squeezing his ass. I'll be fine. Reluctantly, he let her go. In the kitchen, he put all the dishes in the half-size dishwasher and scrubbed at the pan he'd used for the eggs. He turned with a smile when he heard her in the doorway. Hey. You are something else, she said. That's a good thing, right? It makes you a keeper, that's for sure. She started to hobble toward the chair, protesting only with a sigh when he moved to help her. You take such good care of me. Is it still so hard for you to believe I really do like it? She smiled a little and leaned to catch a crumb at the corner of his mouth with her fingertip. No, I know you do. But it's still a little hard for me, sometimes, to admit how much I like you doing it.
I know, but I'm not going to stop, so you'd better get used to it.
Brandon went back to the sink to finish rinsing the pan. When he turned back, she was watching him with a familiar gleam in her eye. His wife might struggle sometimes with how much she liked being in charge, but it didn't stop her from doing it.
What?
Brandon looked over his shoulder, eyes a little wide because he knew exactly what that did for her.
Something on my pants?
You have such a very, very fine ass, Lee said matter-of-factly. It makes me want to take a big bite. In fact, why don't you finish putting away all these dishes so I can ogle you shamelessly? He could manage that. Not a problem at all. In fact, he could go one better.
I can put some away, too,
Brandon told her, stretching to put one of the wine glasses they'd used earlier way up on the highest shelf in the cupboard. One so high, even he had to stretch to reach it. Lee's gaze flared, and her tongue pressed briefly to the center of her upper lip. You are shameless. Brandon grinned and faced her, flexing just a little more than was entirely necessary, and was rewarded with the way she shifted a little in her chair. If he moved his hip just the right way, his loosely tied pants would slip just a little farther down his belly. She liked that, too.
Anything else you need taken care of?
His cock was already telltale tenting in the front of his pajama bottoms, and he didn't miss the look she gave that, too.
I think there's a mop in the closet. I could get that out.
Lee laughed, but throatily. How about a scrub brush and a bucket instead? He gave her another falsely innocent look.
Oh, you'd like me to get on my hands and knees?
He loved the way she laughed, covering up her eyes as though the idea embarrassed her, when he knew better. Something about him getting on his knees for her turned his wife on in a major way. Had the first time they'd met, as a matter of fact, though he hadn't known it at the time. Of course, he hadn't quite known that getting on his knees for her would flip his switch, too. He looked her over.
That would totally turn you on, huh?
Hush. He laughed.
It would.
Careful, Lee warned, or else you'll find yourself on floor scrubbing duty and you won't like it very much.
Baby, whatever gets your motor running is good for me.
He mimicked revving a motorcycle. She laughed at him again. It's not the actual scrubbing part of it. You know that, right? He knew it. It wasn't necessarily what he was doing, be it making her come with his mouth and not his hands, or following her list to the letter, or simply taking over the laundry chores because she hated doing it. It wasn't the tasks he performed that turned her on, but the fact he was willing to do them to please her.
I like to make you happy,
Brandon said with a shrug. It seemed like such a simple thing, even though he knew lots of his buddies would rather have stabbed themselves with hot pokers than admit it, or actually do it. Oh, damn. There were the tears again, glistening subtly but surely. Concerned, he pulled out the chair next to hers and took her hand in both his.
Lee, what's wrong?
She shook her head. Nothing. Disturbed, he searched her face for any sign of what could be bothering her. He ran through a checklist of anything that could be wrong. But as far as he knew, their bank accounts, though still smarting, had started to recover. She seemed to like her new job, and his wasn't putting any strain on them either. It was always entirely possible he'd screwed up somehow, done something stupid and utterly male. But Lee was never shy about letting him know when he did. So he figured it couldn't be that.
It's because of the trip, huh?
It was the only thing he could think of.
I knew it. I should have taken you to the Bahamas. One of those all-inclusive places with lots of fruity drinks.
It's not that. I told you. I like to watch you ski, and I like it too, even if I'm not very good at it. Well, when I'm not falling down the mountain, she amended. Really, honey, it's nothing. She leaned to kiss him, and he knew that was a sweet way of distracting him. But when she slid onto his lap to straddle him, he was more than willing to be distracted. She ran her fingers through his hair as the kiss deepened, and when she stroked her tongue along his dick stirred. Lee said, rocking herself against him. What's this?
Maybe you should find out,
he suggested, trying to kiss her again and letting out a low sigh of semi-frustration when she teased him by pulling away. Maybe I should, she said, as she slipped back into her own chair, wincing a bit when she put weight on her foot. Stand up. He did, standing very still as she looked him over like he was a cupcake in a glass display, like something she wanted to eat right up. God, he hoped that was what she was thinking. Take those off. He slid his pajama bottoms off, tossed them to the side, dick getting harder. She licked her mouth as she looked at his cock. So damn sexy without even half trying. He'd been with girls who'd tried too hard, put on their porn star moves or whatever, thinking that being sexy was something they could do rather than just be. Lee sat up straighter in her chair and looked up at him. Come here. She took hold of his dick at the base, holding him firmly while she guided him closer to her open mouth. Hot breath moved over the head, but instead of taking him into her mouth, she nuzzled at his skin, rubbing him along her cheek, her closed lips, her jawline. She'd made love to his cock without even sucking it, and his balls still got as tight as if she'd taken him down the back of her throat. I love your cock, she breathed, so low he might not have heard her if he hadn't been holding his own breath. Her hand slipped between his legs to cup his balls, her thumb stroking the sensitive part between the sack and his ass. Her other hand still held him at the base as she slid her lips along the length in one long, sweet kiss. Tell me what you'd like me to do to you now.
Use your mouth,
he managed to say, though his throat was a little too dry for speech.
Please?
She hummed laughter against him. Oh, Brandon, I love you so much it hurts. You know that? And I want to taste you just as much. He put his hand on the softness of her hair, which she'd pulled into a bun on top of her head. He tugged away the elastic band and let the strands tumble around her shoulders.
But like when your hair is down.
She kissed his belly. Then, without taking her mouth away, looked up at him. That view, that sultry-eyed, tumble-haired vision, her mouth scant inches from his dick, never failed to send a bolt of sensation running through him. He wanted her mouth on him. But part of this, a big part, was about the waiting. He didn't have to wait too long. Lee nuzzled his cock just a bit more, then tongued the head, paying special attention to the little divot underneath. Then down the shaft, dipping her head to add a swipe of her tongue along his balls that had him stutter out a groan. This time, when she came up, she took him fully into her mouth. Sucking gently, she eased his thickness past her teeth and used the flat of her tongue to stroke him. His hips pumped involuntarily, but she was ready for it, her hands still at the base, keeping him from going too deep or too fast. The chair put her at the perfect height for this, and the table was just right for him to grab for support. And he was going to need it, because when Lee sucked his cock, there was always a good chance his knees were going to get weak. Sometimes she drew it out, not that he ever minded. But today didn't seem to be one of those days. Lee set to fucking him with her mouth, and he gave up to the pleasure of it. Looking down at her, watching her hands slip from his balls to between her legs, watching her rub her clit while she sucked him. Brandon knew a couple of things. 1, he was a very lucky man. 2, he was going to come sooner rather than later. Pleasure built like bricks, one after another, making a wall that had no choice but to come down. He murmured her name. When she looked up at him, her mouth still sucking on him, he shuddered. He thought then she'd release him, maybe urge him to fuck her. On the table, maybe on the counter, maybe even ask him to take her to the bedroom and do it on the bed. But instead, Lee bent back to sucking his dick. Her hand moved faster between her legs, her pace and the rhythm of her sucking faltered just enough to let him know she was being distracted by her own pleasure. That made all of this 10 times hotter. Sometimes it was hard for him to tell if she was close to coming, but not now. The shift of her breath, the small, low moan that vibrated his dick, the way her shoulders jerked a little, they all told him Lee was getting off. She paused, breathing hard, to look up at him with a glazed gaze. Then she bent back, moving faster, using her free hand to stroke him at the same time while the other started up again between her legs. Her orgasm came close after the first, urging a small cry from her and almost tipping him over, but not quite. "God," she breathed, using her hand for the moment instead of her lips and tongue. "That was good." He couldn't really formulate a reply, not when his brain was a haze of sensation centered solely in his dick and nuts. And when she lowered her mouth to him again, adding both hands, one on his shaft and the other stroking his balls, everything became a blaze of white-hot pleasure, blocking out everything else. He thought he said her name, sort of a warning, but Lee didn't pull away, didn't stop. She took him deeper, if that were possible. At least it felt that way. And it felt so fucking good. It didn't matter how far she had him. All that mattered was the hot, wet sucking and the stroking and the sudden firm pressure in the spot just behind his balls from her fingertips. He cried out when he came, jerking, spilling into her mouth. He hadn't realized he tangled his fingers in her hair as tight as he had until the motion of her head tugged at his hand. It was too late, though. He was coming, hard, hips pumping, cock throbbing. When he was finally able to focus, looking down on her, there was no sign of tears. She kissed his belly and leaned back in her chair, head tilted to watch him as she wiped the corner of her mouth with a fingertip. She was smiling so smugly he had to laugh. "Very nice," she told him. He wasn't going to argue. He did glance at the clock, though, as he pulled his pajama bottoms up to his hips again. They'd slept in, and it was already close to noon. "See, we couldn't have done that at my parents' house." "Certainly not now that they've put a queen-sized bed in your old room instead of putting us in the basement," she told him. Which was actually better. "Sure, with all the kids down there playing foosball." He laughed. "Knocking on the door, asking when Uncle Brandon and Aunt Lee are going to wake up. See, it's a good thing it's just us. Once the kids show up, there's no more random dick-sucking at the kitchen table." She gave him an odd look. "Obviously, people with kids still have sex, Brandon." "Well, yeah," he shrugged. "But not like they did before they had kids, right? I mean, the stuff we do." She raised a brow. "What about it?" He ran a finger over the tattoo on his biceps. To most anyone, it would look like a simple band of color. But he knew where to look to see the buckle that made the design a belt. Sort of a joke between them. Since one of the first times they'd ever been together, she'd used his belt to restrain his hands. Lee had a matching one on her belly, low, where only he could ever see it. "These sorts of things," he said. "You mean kinky things?" He hesitated.
Well, yeah.
His wife chewed her lower lip for a second. I imagine nothing is the same after you've had kids. There. He knew it. She wasn't ready for baby talk. And, not wanting to get the conversation headed in the wrong direction, he changed the subject.
What do you want to do today? I can run down to the main lobby and rent some movies.
You're going skiing, Lee said firmly. I'll be fine here by myself, and I don't want you to miss out on anything. It's a ski trip, remember? And besides, you'll have a better time without me holding you back.
That's not...
He began, but bit off the protest when she gave him a look. You'll have a good time by yourself. No sense in staying in with me. I can't go anywhere anyway. I mean it, Brandon. That sealed it for him.
Okay, great. Well, can I get you anything before I go? It won't take me very long to run down...
Brandon, Lee's brow furrowed. Oops. She loved it when he did stuff for her, but he had to remember that despite that, she was a strong and independent woman who also liked it when he didn't. He bent to kiss her, lingering until she poked him. Go, she said. I want to read my book. He snuck another kiss anyway.
I'll only stay out a few hours.
Really, baby, it's fine. You go and have a good time. I'll be okay. I promise. She tipped her face for another kiss, then tweaked his nipple just hard enough to show she meant business. Go. Lee had meant what she said when she told Brandon to go, but it had been a few hours and she'd finished her book. Figuring she'd be spending the days on the slopes and the nights drinking, dancing, and making love, she hadn't thought to pack more than the one she'd been halfway through. It had taken only an hour and a half to whip through the rest of the book. A decent suspenseful thriller that had ended too predictably, but kept her interest, at least. Now she'd flip through the condo's impressive and extensive selection of cable channels, predictably finding nothing to watch. She was bored. She glanced at her phone, but decided against texting Brandon. He'd come home early if she wanted him to, but she didn't want to ruin his ski time any more than she already had. It was only a little after 3, and before he'd left, he'd promised to be home by 5. She looked out the window, which overlooked the center courtyard of the condo complex. There was a nice little restaurant and lodge just past it, along with the small convenience store that sold magazines, paperbacks, snacks, and rented DVDs. The question was, would she be able to hobble her way there and get something? By that point, she was sort of desperate enough to do anything. She stood, testing the pain in her twisted ankle. It was tolerable, especially if she rested it frequently. She figured it would be worth a shot anyway. Get down there, pick up something to read, maybe a movie or two for tonight, head back. They could order in. Unfortunately, in this whole scenario, she hadn't imagined the part where she made it down the condo stairs and across the courtyard, only to set her foot wrong on a patch of ice and twist her ankle again. Fortunately, she didn't scream, though the pain was instant and agonizing enough that she wanted to. Somehow, though, she managed to get herself into a chair next to the big fireplace. So much for not being bored. Now she was still without a book and stranded to boot. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out to spy a familiar number. "Hi, Caroline." "Hi, honey, it's me." Lee smiled. Brandon's mom always said that. "How are you?" "Oh, fine. How's everything out there?" Lee looked around the lodge, so festively decorated, and felt a sudden and extremely unexpected pang. The tree in the corner twinkled, the presents underneath assuredly fake. She'd only spent one Christmas with Brandon's family, but it had seemed so much more like what the holidays should be than this did. She and Brandon had given each other this trip instead of presents, which meant there'd be nothing to open on Christmas Day. No tree or stocking stuffed with trinkets. "It's okay, I guess." "Just okay?" Caroline sounded concerned. "What's wrong?" Brandon was just like his mother in that way. honing in on the slightest hint of trouble. Lee tried to be annoyed, but failed. "Oh, I twisted my ankle, and so I'm not skiing. I'm just here in the lodge, bored. Where's Bingo?" Lee rolled her eyes, but fondly at her mother-in-law's nickname for Brandon. "He's skiing." Well, Caroline didn't quite seem to know what to say to that. "Why? Why isn't he with you?" "I told him to go and have fun, Caroline. It's okay, really. I'm just sort of bored, that's all. He'll be back soon. Then we'll go to dinner." "Oh, good food out there?" And then Caroline was off, rattling away about recipes and the grandkids and Brandon's brothers and their wives and what they were making for dinner or what they'd already made. She talked for a good 10 minutes with Lee needing to do nothing but murmur in response. And just like that, she was finished. "I just wanted to check in, honey. Make sure you're both doing well. Having fun." Another pang of guilt washed over Lee at that, even though she was sure Caroline hadn't meant to make her feel bad. "I'm sorry we're not there for Christmas." There was a pause long enough to prove that Caroline, no matter what she said, felt the same. But then she gave a motherly tut-tut. "Don't be silly. You kids need to have a nice vacation. And I know it's the only time you could take since your company closes for this week. No sense in wasting that time coming to see us when we can come to you in a couple weeks, right?" That was how they'd presented the idea originally, but now it sounded selfish and lame. "I guess so, sure. It'll be great." "You sure you're okay, honey?" Lee assured her she was and spent another 5 minutes with Caroline saying goodbye. She considered texting her husband to see where he was, but again refrained. Instead, she dialed a familiar number. "Hey, I thought you were on vacation," greeted her best friend Kate. Lee relayed the story quickly. "So now I'm in the lodge." "Dude, call that handsome husband of yours to come get you. He totally will, and you can spend the rest of the afternoon riding him like a pony." "I know, but I don't want him to miss out on skiing, that's all." Kate laughed. "You know he won't care. Given the choice between getting his crank yanked and skiing, don't you think Brandon would choose the sex?" Lee laughed too. "Of course, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be selfish of me to make him." "Selfish," Kate snorted, then muttered as though she had a hand over the phone. "No, I will not tell her I want a slumber party and a pillow fight." Louder, Kate said, "My handsome husband gives his regards." Lee had worked with Kate's husband, Charles Dixon, for a number of years before being laid off from her job. "Tell Dix I said he'd better be treating you right or else he and I will have a little talk." "Oh, he is, no question about that. He doesn't know I peeked at the boxes under the tree. One is definitely jewelry-shaped." Another pang poked her at the thought of having no presents to open on Christmas Day. "You have the girls this year?" "Yep, Christmas Day. Don't get me started on what we had to do to get Pickles to agree to that," Kate said, referring to Dix's ex-wife. "Let's just say if I could feasibly get away with signing her up for a Match.com account and hooking her up with someone who'd take her away, anywhere, far away, I would." Lee made a face. "But having the girls on Christmas, that'll be fun, won't it?" There was a pause before Kate said, "What's up with you?" Lee sighed, shifting in the chair to put her bad ankle up on the coffee table. All around her were people laughing, eating, talking. She spotted the family from the restaurant, the toddler bundled in a hat, scarf, and coat, and in a much better mood today. The mother held the baby on her hip, and it was obvious the father had taken the older child skiing, while Mama and baby hung out in the lodge. Lee wondered if the father had skied tandem with his kid, and a sudden image of Brandon teaching their children to ski hit her so hard she had to shake her head to clear it. "You're like the third person who's asked me that," she said. "Must mean something is. Spill it." "Do you think you and Dix will have kids?" The silence was longer this time. "Oh, girl," Kate said finally. You got the fever? No. Lee watched the parents helping the kids get settled at one of the tables. Well, maybe. Kate laughed. What does Bingo think about that? Well, here's the thing. I'd have said he was a green light for it, definitely. But he's been making noise, like having kids would cramp our style. They do, Kate said. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have them. I know, and believe me, it's not like I've been mooning around peeking in strollers and wishing for a bitty baby spit-up of my very own. But something, I don't know, it doesn't feel like Christmas here. Lee said more vehemently than she'd intended. No bedazzled sweaters? I'm sure I'll get one in a few weeks when Bill and Caroline come to visit, but that's not the point. I thought it would be great to go on vacation this week, so I wouldn't have to take extra time off work since the office is closed. I thought it would be exciting and romantic and all that to spend our first married Christmas alone. But Kate, I spent so many Christmases like this. Or alone. I don't like it as much as I thought I would. When she was young, there had been gifts left by Santa and a nice dinner, sometimes cooked by her mom, but most often at a restaurant. Her parents were the ones who liked to travel for Christmas. This year they'd gone to Japan, of all places. And to be fair, they had invited her and Brandon to join them. But the trip was too long and too expensive. It was nothing like Christmas with the Longs, who hung their tree with popcorn and cranberries and sang carols and drank hot chocolate spiked with Godiva liqueur until midnight, where the family with the youngest child got to keep the tiny stocking for the whole year. She pointed her toes, feeling the ache in her ankle. Though having to stay off my feet does make a nice reason for him to wait on me hand and foot. As if he needed a reason. Lee smiled. I know. So don't waste your time talking to me. Text your dude. Go on, Kate said. I've got cookies to bake or something like that. They said their goodbyes, and Lee disconnected the call, hesitating only a few more seconds before thumbing a message to Brandon's number. She thought it likely he wouldn't be able to get to his phone right away, but within half a minute his reply came through, sending a little shiver of delight through her. Be there right away. It was billed in the brochure as a romantic moonlit getaway, and a festive holiday sleigh ride through snowy pastures decorated for the season in a spectacular display of animated lights set to classic carols and holiday tunes. There'd been nothing about waiting in line for 40 minutes in frigid air for a two-person sleigh instead of a horse-drawn hay wagon that could carry 30 people. Nor that, though the cider and hot chocolate and coffee was free and plentiful, the porta-potties were clear on the other side of the building and not marked. Or that the horses announced just what they thought of the whole situation by dropping their fragrant piles all over the place. You warm enough? Brandon rubbed Lee's mitten-clad hands between his thick gloves. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her bad foot propped up on a little pile of snow he'd pushed together to make a footstool for her. Yep. That cider smells amazing. You want some? She laughed. I think one adventure to the Porta-John was enough. Don't you? We're next anyway, Brandon said just as the white sleigh decorated with boughs of holly and whatever the fa-la-la that other stuff was, jingled to a stop in the line. He stood, joints creaking from the cold, then bent to help her up. Getting to the sleigh was slightly less of an adventure than taking her to the bathroom had been, and they were both giggling by the end of it as he helped her into the high seat. The driver looked over his shoulder at them, his scarf pulled up high on his mouth, his hat pulled low over his eyes. You guys ready? Lee settled onto the leather seat and pulled aside the thick quilts to make room for Brandon. Hi! The driver ducked his head at her as the horse stamped impatiently, blowing out a breath into the cold air. Hiya! Brandon took his seat and pulled the quilts up over their legs. Warm. God. The ride lasts about 45 minutes, maybe a bit longer if we get backed up at some of the more popular attractions, the driver said, sounding bored.
Prepare to be amazed by the coordinated light and music display of holiday cheer."
"He sounds totally cheerful," Lee whispered in Brandon's ear when the driver turned back and clucked at the horses. "I'm amazed by his enthusiasm." Brandon leaned in to nuzzle at her cheek and murmur,
"He's probably It's a Small World and jingle-belled out. Just guessing."
The sleigh jerked into motion, the horse setting off at a lazy pace. The driver chucked at it again, and it went a little faster for a few steps, then slowed again. Lee got the giggles beside him as they pulled away from the waiting area and headed across a dark, snowy field. Just beyond them, down the dip of a hill, they could see the glow of what Brandon was sure was going to be a holiday display of the cheesiest proportions. But for now, the sky was still dark enough that he could tip his face back and stare up at the bright points of the stars.
"So much for moonlight,"
he said. "I like it better this way. Dark." Lee's hand crept into his lap to give his crotch a sexy squeeze. "And the stars are so pretty." Brandon shifted his knees apart to give her better access, though he was pretty sure she wasn't going to keep going.
"Yeah."
He breathed in the cold air that felt even colder now that they had the weight of the blankets on them. Cheese-tastic and expensive it might be, but a sleigh ride at Christmas time with his wife was exactly as romantic as the brochure had promised. Her fingers tightened briefly on his half-hard dick and pulled away as the sleigh went over the edge of the hill and down, the horse moving a little faster and the lights ahead of them now bright. They could hear the music, too, tinny at this distance but still familiar. It was, indeed, It's a Small World. The driver slowed the horse as it approached the first path of lighted displays, because, as he'd predicted, they'd caught up to the hay wagon in front of them. The displays were pretty typical, tube lighting outlining traditional Christmas scenes. A house, a sleigh, a carousel. Reindeer that moved their heads up and down, all set to music. Pretty. The lights reflected on Lee's face, green and blue and red. She was smiling at the scenes in front of them.
"You're prettier,"
he said into her ear. She looked at him. "Oh, am I?" This time he slipped his hand into her lap and pressed gently. He grinned.
"Uh-huh."
He thought she'd shake her head or simply push his hand away, but to his delight, his wife just shifted on the seat, opening her thighs a little wider. There wasn't much he could do through the denim of her jeans, but, well, he sure could try. "Oh, elves," Lee murmured, her gaze on the first display they'd finally pulled up in front of. She rocked her hips just enough against his hand that he knew she wasn't paying one damned bit of attention to the elves. "Look at the elves, Brandon." He did. Not because he was worried the driver could see what was going on beneath the layers of quilts, but because Lee had told him to. Because it was sexy this way, something forbidden, something he was doing that normally she wouldn't allow, but he knew she really, really liked. The next display was of a house with Santa's sleigh on top and a fat Santa in front, waving in a steady metronome. The music had changed to a chorus of what sounded like castrati singing "O Tannenbaum." Lee wrinkled her nose but didn't look away from the lights and music. Didn't look at him. She drew in a breath as he watched her. With his fingers inside her, his mouth on her pussy, Brandon could usually tell what was working for her. But here, with the barriers of clothing between them, unable to sink into her heat, or even able to tell if he was pressing her clit or some random spot, all he had to go on was the subtle shift of her expression. Making his wife come was always a challenge, not because she had a hard time achieving orgasm, but because, in purely feminine fashion, there was way more to getting her off than hitting the right spots. He could go down on her for an hour, and if she was worried about paying the mortgage, she might never come. If he switched up the pace too much, if the phone rang, if something on the television sounded too loud, she could lose her concentration. It seemed to him that a haphazard pressure against her clit through her jeans, jostling by the sleigh, hitting bumps in the snowy path. Hell, the entirely unsexy sound of adolescent boys with their nuts cut off singing about a Christmas tree, all of that should probably have made it really difficult for him to make her come. But something told him she was getting close anyway. His dick was pressing almost painfully against his zipper, but he didn't care. He'd get his later or suffer the ache of blue balls. It didn't matter. For the moment, all Brandon really cared about was seeing if he could pull this off. Get her off. Make her lose a tiny bit of the control she so prided herself on keeping. She wasn't stopping him, but she wasn't helping. Hadn't unzipped her jeans to let him slip his fingers inside. Unspoken, she'd made rules he had to follow. Brandon bit the inside of his cheek against his grin. He could do that. No problem. The people on the hay wagon ahead of them were cheering at something, but had stalled again. The sleigh wasn't moving. The driver stared ahead, maybe sullen or bored, maybe just discreet. All around them the music went on and on while Santa waved in a steady tick-tock. Tick-tock. Press. Release. Over and over. Brandon pushed his knuckles against her. Her lips parted, just slightly. She didn't say anything, didn't look at him. It was enough to tell him he was on the right path. Lee let out a tiny cry when the sleigh started up again, and it sounded like it could have been because she was startled by the sudden jerk. But Brandon knew better. He didn't change the pressure, though, or the pace. They passed by the Santa and on to the next display, but he kept up the same steady tick-tock of his knuckles against her. The ride was, as the driver had predicted, closer to an hour than 45 minutes. By the end of it, Lee's eyelashes had begun to flutter in a familiar way, and when she forced herself to focus, her eyes had a certain glaze in them that Brandon loved. She stumbled getting out of the sleigh, and he caught her, but he was pretty sure this time it had nothing to do with her sore ankle. "Get me home," she muttered into his ear as he helped her stand upright. "As fast as possible." 20 minutes later, he was up to his balls inside her, both of them not even undressed. They hadn't even made it more than a few feet past the front door. Pants around his ankles, her jeans undone and shoved to her thighs. He lifted her, hands under her ass, and used the wall behind her to steady himself as he fucked deep inside her. It always worked better in the movies, but for right now, this moment, these 3 minutes, it was fucking magic. "I'm going to call you Fuck Machine from now on," she said to him on a gasp that became a giggle as he started to slip out of her when they'd both come within seconds of each other. "Oh, oops." He put her down gently, holding her carefully because neither of them was too steady on their feet. "Fuck Machine, huh? It's better than bingo." Or band boy, which is what Lee's friend Kate liked to call him. Lee pushed up on her good set of toes to kiss his mouth. "Yes, Fuck Machine. Dear Fuck Machine, please pick up the dry cleaning on the way home. It has a ring, doesn't it?" "If I'm Fuck Machine, what do I call you?" This was a game with them. She told him long ago she would never make him call her mistress or anything like that. Usually he stuck with honey, baby, sometimes a sweetie, if he was feeling particularly smoochy. She kissed him again, and then pulled her panties and jeans up before limping toward the kitchen. "Right now, how about Gimpy?" "Fuck Machine and Gimpy. Sounds like a really bad porno movie." He heard her laughter from the kitchen, then the sound of the mini-fridge opening, the crack of a cola tab. He found her pouring them both glasses of soda. She tossed a bag of chips on the table, too. Aren't most porno movies bad in some way or another? "I wouldn't know," Brandon said self-righteously. "I don't watch them." "Ha! Only the free ones on YouPorn. I have your number, fuck machine, and your internet browsing history. Don't even try to tell me otherwise. She handed him his glass and stole another kiss. Unless you want me to put the parental blocks on the internet or something. She paused, looking into his face, her lips brushing his again. Would that be considered a disciplinary action?
Maybe if I don't scrub the floor good enough, you can cut off my porn privileges,
he offered with wide eyes, putting on the innocent face he knew she loved. Lee tweaked his nose and kissed him again, then hugged him hard and unexpectedly tight. God, I love you. He hugged her back, pulling her onto his lap for a cuddle.
I love you too.
She buried her face into his neck, her breath warm on him. He thought she might say something else, but Lee stayed quiet. And for just then, Brandon was content to sit there and hold her, without saying anything either. 2 days before Christmas, 4 into their vacation, and they'd eaten at every restaurant within walking distance of the condo complex, and taken every tour offered that didn't require a lot of walking. Snow had been falling steadily since the night before, and though Lee was pretty sure Vale had more than its share of snow, the people here were acting like it was some sort of magic. It was pretty, she thought with a glance out the window. But nothing special. Nothing here felt that special. Not the lights, the music, or the Dickensian carolers on the street corner. Her husband, on the other hand, still felt and looked and smelled and tasted special. This vacation had been fantastic for their sex life, which, to be fair, was pretty spectacular anyway, but had fallen into a regular once or twice a week rut over the past few months.
This game is ridiculous. What, Parcheesi would have been out of the question?
Brandon gestured at the game board of alternating blue and red spaces and the 2 stacks of cards. They'd found the game in the closet. Truth or dare. The premise was simple, but sexy times for couples had been imprinted on the front of the plain black box in swirly hot pink letters. Brandon had made fun of it at once, but Lee had teased him into playing. You say that because you're losing, she told him.
I'm saying it because it's lame.
He shook the dice in the cardboard tube and let them roll, then moved his marker 4 spots. Lee pulled a card from the dare pile with a smirk. Dares were worth 10 points, but so far all of them had been either slightly humiliating or stupid. Blow your own horn, she read, then flipped the card to show him the genderless stick figure illustration of a person, legs over its head, face buried in its crotch. If you can do that, fuck machine, I will divorce you. He was laughing and shaking his head.
Why?
Because you won't have any need for me anymore. She tossed the card down. Let's see it, bendy man.
Nope, no way. Not even gonna try it.
Fine. Lee rolled, got a 6, landed on a truth spot. 5 points for me.
You have to answer the question first.
He pulled a card and read.
What sexual act have you wanted to do but never did?
That wasn't a bad question, actually. Not like some of them had been. Nothing.
Oh, come on. Really? Everyone has something they wanted to do, but never did.
Lee thought quickly about her sexual history. Most of it had been good. There'd been some bad times, most notably with Mike, her ex. But even that had been more about doing things she didn't want to do. And since meeting Brandon, honestly, baby, anything I've ever really wanted to do, I've done. With you. I can't think of anything I've wanted to do that we haven't done. He looked pleased.
Uh-huh.
I'm serious. She leaned across the coffee table to poke him, but he captured her hand and kissed the fingertips. I am, Brandon.
Well, good.
She eyed him. What about you? He let go of her hand, studiously writing down her 5 points on the notepad that had come with the game. Look at me. He did. But this time, she wasn't interested in a fake innocent look. "What sexual thing have you wanted to do that you haven't?" Brandon shrugged.
Nothing."
Uh-huh. She fixed him with a steady, stern look. "Spill it."
2 women at once?
That sounded like a question, not an answer. "You can tell me, you know. I mean, it's not like we can't be honest with each other." Lee swallowed, a little uneasy. What on earth could he want to do that they hadn't already done? There was a list 7 miles long, actually, of places they'd not yet gone. She knew her sweet-faced choir boy of a husband wasn't nearly as innocent as she liked him to pretend to be. He was curious, open-minded, and, frankly, spent a lot more time on the internet than she did. There was no telling what he'd stumbled across in some of those forums she knew he'd joined. For Lee, it was not about lingerie or binding his hands or leaving him lists or making him obey. Those were the little kinks they both enjoyed, things that got them hot and bothered. But her need to top him was deeper than that. It was not about making him obey her, but about triggering something in both of them, mentally and not just physically. The sex was great, yes, but she gained just as much pleasure from knowing Brandon hung her laundry in color-coordinated rows because he knew how much she hated doing the laundry. It was about letting him take care of her totally and completely, which was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. Allow him so close to her she didn't have to worry he'd ever let her down. They had a life together, not a lifestyle.
"Every guy wants to be with 2 women.
"I'm sure every guy does, which is why I know you're full of shit," she told him. "I mean, I'm not saying that you wouldn't love it, but I don't believe that's what you're really thinking about when you jack your cock in the shower." He gave her a rueful smile.
"Sometimes it is."
Lee didn't laugh. "What about the other times?"
"I'd like to tie you up. Use a blindfold."
Of all the things he could have said, it wasn't exactly the most shocking, and he'd said it hesitantly, gently. There was no reason for her to recoil, but that's what she did.
"Lee, I'm sorry, I didn't—"
"Shh," she told him, her brow furrowed. Mouth sewn tight to stop herself from saying something she didn't want to say. Brandon went quiet at once. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. He kissed her palm as she cupped his cheek. He closed his eyes, breathing, and his shoulders rose and fell. Before Brandon, Lee had spent too many months with Mike, who'd been all too happy to fulfill what had been her misunderstood desire. With Mike, Lee had been the submissive one. But, unlike the relationship she'd built with Brandon upon mutual desire and respect, not just top and bottom, Mike had taken advantage of Lee's willingness to serve him. He hadn't abused her, nothing like that. He'd used his neckties to attach her hands to the bedposts, not because she liked it, but because he'd read about it in a men's magazine and had thought it sounded kinky. Mike had turned out to be an enormous, arrogant dick, and Lee had walked away determined never to let another man dominate her ever again. Yet it had taken meeting Brandon for her inherently dominant side to emerge, and even then she'd fought what it meant to be on top. She couldn't blame him for wanting to taste it now.
"Not because I want to boss you around," he said quietly, "but because I think you'd like it."
"I've been tied up. I don't like it," she said bluntly, not wanting to remind him she'd fucked other men, that he wasn't her first kinky relationship, but saying it anyway.
"Because I think you'd like it if you could just enjoy it."
She looked into his eyes. "I enjoy being with you. Like we are." He smiled.
"I know. But you're always thinking. You're always, in control."
Lee swallowed, seeking words and not finding the ones that made the best sense. "I thought you liked that too."
"I do." He shrugged a little. "Fuck me. I really do." But sometimes, when you give me a list, when you tell me what to do, how to stand or what to wear or how long to lick you, it's so easy to just get all caught up in that. A little bit lost, in a good way, a great way. I don't have to think about anything. I don't have to wonder if I'm going to make you come because you tell me just exactly how to do it. I fucking love it.
Good, she breathed.
I want to do that for you. That's all. I want you to sometimes just not have to worry about anything. Not be in charge.
He looked uncomfortable.
Give up to me. Just a little.
Lee took her hand from his and tucked both of them against her sides while she thought about this. She felt hot, a little shaky, but not entirely repulsed. Brandon, you know I trust you.
I hope so.
Is this what you really want? He nodded, no longer looking hesitant or uncomfortable. Lee sighed, swallowing again, her throat a little tight. Their relationship had never been about one of them forcing the other into something. It wouldn't be now. Okay. She blew out a breath, expecting her gut to get tight, but instead giggling at the look on his face. Brandon blinked rapidly, then burst into one of those brilliant smiles she found so incredibly lovely. He leaned across the table to kiss her.
I love you. You know that? He said. You're awesome.
You're horny.
Well, that,
he said, and kissed her more slowly.
But you're still awesome.
She took his face in her hands. Now?
It doesn't have to be now.
She wiggled to reach around and cup his crotch. This says now.
I'm not going to turn it down, Brandon said. But I want you to be sure this is okay.
She tilted her head to study him. You know when we play, I never do anything you don't want, and all you ever have to do is tell me to stop, and I will. I trust you. He nodded. Then he pushed the table out of the way, scattering the game, and bent to scoop her up. Lee let out a breathless flurry of nervous giggles and clung to him. He was so big. He always made her feel tiny and precious, but never small. Do what you want to me, Lee whispered, and was rewarded by the flash of desire in his dark eyes. In the bedroom, he settled her on the same chair she'd been on a few days ago. There, her husband slipped her t-shirt over her head and unhooked her bra. He eased her jeans over her hips, shifting her to lift her ass so he could get them off. Then her panties. Then he wiggled her into position on the chair and put his hands to his waist. Oh, Lee said. One of the first times they'd ever fucked, she'd bound his hands behind him with a belt he now pulled inch by slow inch from the loops. The sound of it, that thwack, thwack of leather against denim, tightened her nipples and sent a pulse to her clit. She put her hands behind her, and he slid the loop of leather over her wrists. Not tight enough to hurt, or even really tie her. At any moment she could move if she wanted to. She didn't. Brandon pulled a hand-woven silk scarf from her suitcase. He'd bought it for her from an arts festival. She usually wore it in her hair or draped lightly around her throat. Now he doubled the fabric and tied it over her eyes. The darkness wasn't complete, and, in fact, if she tipped her head, she could see beneath it. She closed her eyes instead. And then she waited. She waited for him to stick his cock in her mouth or to grab her breasts, shove a hand between her legs. She should have known better. Her Brandon would never be so crass. He breathed on her instead, hot, silky breath on her face, over her cheek, her jaw, down her throat, until she tipped her head back in an unconscious appeal for him to put his mouth to her skin. He did, but briefly. His lips soft and unhurried, but not lingering. Over her bare shoulder. behind her, down her arm, to her hand, and then her fingers. He kissed them one at a time, sucking gently on her forefinger, then gently biting the soft pad of flesh at the tip. With the scarf on her eyes and her hands immobilized, all she could do was imagine what might come next. And Brandon was right. There was something intensely arousing about not having to think so hard, not having to direct the show. Lee drew in a long, deep breath and let it out. She gave up to him. He took his time about it, touching her gently, then harder when she sighed and wriggled, murmuring words of love as he made love to her with his hands and mouth without ever moving her from the chair. By the time he stroked his cock across her closed lips, she was ready to open them to him. Lee drew in a breath at the sensation of his flesh on hers, at the tangle of his fingers in her hair. But she opened her mouth anyway and took him inside. Without her hands, she couldn't guide him, but she didn't worry he'd push too deep or gag her. She trusted him, and Brandon didn't betray that trust as he pushed gently inside. She sucked and was rewarded by the sound of his moan, a sound that sent an instant jolt of pleasure between her legs. He liked getting head. Of course he did. The same way she liked it when he was on his knees lapping at her pussy, but forbidden from using his hands. She didn't miss the echo of their earlier lovemaking, and remembering how it felt to be the one in charge added to the sensations building inside her now as the one at her husband's mercy. She wasn't new to this. She'd been on the bottom many times in the past before admitting to herself she really wanted to be on top. But she was new to being like this for Brandon. And somehow, that made it all different. He didn't force, didn't push, just gave her the chance to suck his cock after spending enough time making sure she'd want to. His cock, slick from her attentions, slipped from her lips, and Lee turned her head to feel it against her cheek.